Well, normally going from 0 to 1 is considered the hardest, but I'm finding 1 to 2 fairly difficult. Welcome to the second episode of the as of yet unnamed studio build-out for KTQA here on my brand new YouTube channel. I continue to be Sam, and I am now sitting next to my rack, which, as you might notice, isn't empty anymore. It's got a bunch of stuff in it. In the last week, I've spent some time working on the IP side of things, the stuff that faces the internet, and the stuff that, the digital, sort of the beep boop side of it, basically, minus the actual audio handling. Basically, the infrastructure that will allow the community to come into this space and do the production side, posting it to the internet, getting it to a place where we can put it on the air, and, all of the support stuff before we actually deal with the audio side. So that's what we're working on today. And as usual, I built it out of stuff I could find, stuff I scrounged, stuff I had lying around, and some stuff I bought legitimately, which is kind of rare for me, but I did it this time. So for now, we'll start with we're going to go into what what we'll call Ashen's Vision, or Big Clivo Vision, and we'll go over some of the equipment that I've bought, and then we'll do a little discussion about how I put this network together, and, well, that'll kind of be it for this episode. So let's talk about what's going to go into the rack, and let's start with the switch. Here is the first switch I bought. Yes, it is trash. It is probably 15 years old, but it works. It has a iOS interface on it. It has, a bunch of ports, a serial port, an iOS style interface. You could speak to it over SSH, over serial, and it had a web interface. I don't need that smart of a switch, but it would be nice to debug network connectivity problems as time goes on. If a problem develops and, well, if you're getting a rack mount switch, chances are it's going to have some sort of intelligence in it. Unfortunately, the web interface is really old, and the only language it speaks is, it really only talks to Internet Explorer, and it has like an ActiveX controller or something like this. And the last thing I wanted sitting on my network is a switch that only spoke to a dead and insecure browser. So I decided, no, not this. This will be used for something else. What I got instead was this guy. Again, this was at least in the last decade. It's a Dell Force 10 S25. See if I can show that to you. Yeah, see. And it's got a Cisco console port, and it does all sorts of neat stuff. And it works, and I got it configured, and it's ready to go. Doesn't do SSH, doesn't do web interface, but at least it isn't exposing Internet Explorer stuff on my network, and it's all good to go. So the other thing that I got was this IPKVM. It's an Avocent DSR 2020. It's not a style I've used before, but it was dirt cheap, and it came with hopefully a couple of connectors. So hopefully I'll have some sort of IP KVM going on. It occurred to me in production that I never explained what a KVM actually is. KVM in this case stands for Keyboard, Video, and Mouse. In the olden days when I was a rack room rat, it was a way that you could connect multiple computers to a single keyboard, mouse, and monitor so that you could control multiple machines from one place. So you didn't have to have 5,000 monitors and keyboards and mice to go with 5,000 computers. In modern times, they actually now export the video signals and keyboard control over network connection, so you don't even have to be in the rack room anymore in order to control these machines. And for a guy like me, that saves you a lot of time. Sometimes I don't even have to get out of bed in order to fix a computer, even if it's not responding on the internet. So one of these things is a really nice thing to have. Yes, it's quite old, in fact. It doesn't work in modern Java, and I have to run an old Java in a virtual machine in order to use it. That's okay with me. I have to run an old version of Java anyway for other reasons, which you'll probably see later on. And if you're confused that this KVM is not the kernel-based virtual machine that comes with the Linux kernel, then, yeah, I'm also confused. I was definitely confused by that. Anyway, back to my mumbling. So that's the sort of the not active equipment that we're going to be using, and now we're going to talk about some of the stuff that I built myself. This here's the router. This is, I think we're calling it Cobble. This is, I put it together myself. It's in a Supermicro short case, which is nice. Whenever I can get my hands on some old Supermicro cases, I usually do, because they can be usually used to fit worthwhile equipment, or, you know, Supermicro tends to stick to standards where other rack mount equipment makers, like, say, Dell, would not. Yeah, this isn't going to come out easy, is it? Oh, it's screwed in. Of course it is. I'm silly. You know, I put this thing together. I wasn't expecting to show it to people, so I put it completely together. That's going to be true for a lot of these systems. So, not much to this system. So the original machine was like a super old Zen system. This board is a ASRock. I forget the model number, but the processor it's got on it is a Celeron J1900 10-watt TDP, 4 cores, 2 gigahertz clock, soldered on the board with a passive heatsink. This is the same computer I used to run the studio for the radio show, for the old studio. Just one of these motherboards, and it does the job. So they're pretty good for what they do. Then I've got this DC to DC power supply that I got from I know not where. I needed to do a little bit of creative wiring to get the front panel to work with this motherboard, and for now I have to use a Flex PCIe connector. I got a riser on order, but for now that's what I'm using until it comes in. And this thing, with all this stuff in it, it weighs nothing. For storage, I am just using a USB key. This is going to run OpenBSD because I find PF a lot easier to use than IP tables or NF tables or whatever networking suite du jour Linux is using. The sort of unified language of PF in OpenBSD. And, you know, OpenBSD's secure nature I find pretty good. So that's that machine. As I said before, it's got a DC-DC power supply, so all I have to do is feed it 12 volts, and it powers right up. And that's pretty good. I mean, that's easy to do. I don't know where I got that particular power supply. It was just sitting in my parts bin. So I can't tell you, you know, was it an eBay purchase? Was it something I got at a flea market or a Hamfest or at an electronics recycler? No idea. Whenever I see them, I tend to pick them up. And it works pretty good. You know, sometimes I got to replace a bad cap or something. But keeps heat down in the rack, which is nice. And in the studio, and in an environment like this one, silent is good. So a system that generates as little noise as possible is good. Although that's kind of blown away by this guy. This is Lapis, and you may have figured out the sort of the naming scheme of our servers, but this was the machine that gave us the idea for the naming scheme. Well, the thing is, this computer, this case is just a 2U ATX case that just takes generic hardware. And so when you find those going to the scrap pile, I almost always pull them aside. But it sat on my porch for a long time, and when I pulled it off, we discovered that ash had got in from a previous firestorm and had started corroding on.
Well, at about this point, the camera had stopped working and beeped at me. I don't know why it stopped. It has an enormous SD card in it, has tons of space left. I've only just started using the thing, but the video stopped. And by the time I got back to it, I had completely forgotten that I was in the middle of telling a story, so I should probably tell it now. So I found this case in a junk pile, and I took it home with me and put it on my front porch, where it sat for a couple, 3 years. And when we needed to build this machine, I pulled it off the porch and took it upstairs, and thanks to some previous wildfires that had caused ash to rain on the city of Tacoma, it had corroded on the inside. It had corroded pretty bad. Where it is in the porch, the water doesn't get it, so condensation really wasn't as much of a factor as the ash clearly was. So Becky not only washed it, but she gave it this really nice paint color. She kind of took it on as a fun project that she could kind of, I guess, make my rack room look a little bit nicer. I certainly appreciated it. And we noticed that it looked a little bit like a certain substance from a certain video game, so that gave us the idea of how to name our machines. So that's the story. Now let's get back to looking at it.
Well, let's continue. So, Becky, who I don't know that I've introduced on the channel, but is my partner in many things, including life, decided she wanted to spray paint it. And so she spray painted it this metal flick color. Ooh. My wrist didn't like that at all. Tell you what, I'm going to get this off and then... Okay, so here's the inside of this machine. It's, I built this machine in 2012. It ran my personal network for a long time, Vishnu. It's a FX 6300 with 32 gig of RAM, 6 cores at some reasonable clock speed. Well, okay, so it has two 8 terabyte drives I shucked from an external drive bay, a 256 gigabyte SSD for booting and whatnot. It has an old power supply that I had to rewire in order to fit in this case. It's got USB 3 ports on the front. It actually has an optical drive for ripping CDs. It's a fairly straightforward case, but one of the problems it has is that it's only SATA 2. It doesn't have SATA 3 on it. So I was going to install this SATA 3 card in it, but the riser, the PCIe riser that was supposed to be in here isn't. And I have no idea where it went. So that's going to cut that short, but there's really nothing interesting in, I mean, geez, if you've installed one PCI, ISA, I mean, any kind of expansion card in a computer, you know what you're getting into. There's nothing special going on there. So there's really no reason to watch it. I was just going to use it as something of visual interest as to while I explain stuff. Honestly, from here on in, it's going to be me installing that card, moving some SATA cables around, and then slapping operating systems on these things and then putting them on. This guy is going to run all our VMs. It's going to be most of our storage. It's going to be our VoIP system. It's going to do things. It's going to run Zen, because that's my preferred virtualization system. So that's where we're going with that. I don't have any mounting gear for this. So here's another garbage thing that I do. Sure, you could buy a generic shelf, but that's $30 and takes a long time. Or you can just go get aluminum C-channel and install, cut it to the length. and then use the braces of your enclosed rack to hold it up for now. This is what I'm going to start with to hold this guy up. Everything else just bolts to the rack and stays up that way. Or I've got actual rack shelving for that. But for this guy, I'm just going to attach it to the front and then use these guys to hold it up for now. And I'll get a real shelf for it somewhere along the way. Those are the systems, so that's what I'm kind of working on this week. And now I'll give you I guess we'll cut to an explanation of how the network is going to be set up.
Okay, so before we move on to the network description, there are 3 devices in the rack that we haven't seen since they hadn't arrived for recording day. The first are Diorite and Andesite, 2 TP-Link Archer C7s that I brought from a recycler that run OpenWRT. The other is Shulker, which is a Raspberry Pi 4 with 4 GB of RAM connected to a USB 3 hard drive enclosure. The enclosure, Raspberry Pi, and its snazzy Flirt case are all new, but the drives in the enclosure are garbage X-RAID members, so there's that. Alright, so let's move on to the network. So, here it is. Here it will be. This is a white void, I guess. Okay, so from within this white void, let's talk about how everything is connected together in the beep boop world. Like every horrible monstrosity built out of garbage, it begins with the internet. Now, I didn't build the internet, or at least very much of it, so there's not a lot to talk about here. Get as much pipe as you can afford, wait for it to be installed, wash, rinse, repeat. So let's move on to the firewall. We've taken a look at old Cobble already, and we'll look at new Cobble in the future. This chart already assumes that new Cobble is installed and running OpenBSD 6.8, which isn't technically out yet. It sits there with a pile of Ethernet interfaces and just passes packets around, so it's not all that interesting. But in the bespoke afterworld that is 2020, you can't have a place without a way for a phone to connect to the internet, so Diorite comes to the rescue. For once. One port of Cobble is plugged directly into Diorite and lives in its own bandwidth-limited world. Upstream and downstream are currently limited to 4 megabit each way, as we need the rest of the pipe for station operations. Another port on Cobble goes to the switch you saw already. Not much else to say here, so...
Ding!
And here's where Lapis comes in. It runs Zen Hypervisor with Arch Linux in the DOM0 and has 2 LVM groups. Lapis G1 is the previously mentioned 1TB SSD for roots and small VMs, and Lapis G2 is the 2 8TB mechanical drives in a RAID 1 array for mass storage. If you understood all that, seek medical attention. Running on Lapis is har. It's apparently a Scottish word for a kind of fog. I don't know, it's kind of a play on words. It's a Nextcloud instance, and then Phone, which obviously runs phone stuff, a PBX. Other VMs will be added as needed, but I don't see a need for a lot of other VMs running on this hardware, which is why I was okay with somewhat dated hardware as our VM host. Then we've got Lever, which is connected to the USB and video of all the other machines, so I can see what's going on from home, and be lazy.
Noise.
If systems that actually have to do station stuff need Wi-Fi, here comes Andesite. It sits inside the network and acts as a wireless AP. Right now, only my laptop is connecting to it, so, big deal. And then finally we have Shulker, which is 4 garbage 1TB drives hooked up in RAID 0. It receives logs from the other machines and then pulls a backup from other systems using rsync. It is patiently waiting for the day when I can buy it newer drives. You'll also notice that I've only used half the page. That's because there's a whole other side of the network that I haven't shown you yet. We'll be speaking to that network over WireGuard, but you don't get to see that yet. Maybe we'll save that for some sort of channel milestone? I don't know.
And that is a description of the IP side of the network, of the studio setup. It only took me about a week to do, save for waiting for some hardware to come in. And I just decided to slideshow it and show you pictures and some clips of the hardware because, honestly, having a camera pointed at me or at my monitor while I'm just typing commands in and compiling software doesn't seem that interesting to me. But if that's something that you want to see, that's something I would definitely take feedback on. And that's episode 2. In episode 3, we're going to work a little bit on the environment. We're going to move away from software and into hardware. For example, we're going to do something about this hole I'm sitting in, and we're going to talk about, I don't know, maybe some of the things that are in this shot? Perhaps? Maybe? See you then.
Once again, it's time to thank the patrons. Thank you all very much for supporting me through this new effort and supporting us throughout the years. I'd also like to thank the new patrons that joined up as a direct result of this new video project that I'm working on. I'm a bit surprised by that. If you'd like to join the Patreon, you get early access to the videos and a bunch of weird stuff behind the scenes. You can find a link to my Patreon in the video description, as usual. Thank you very much. See you next week.